This video is about row grouping in AGGrid. I will be using the plain JavaScript version of AGGrid, however everything we're going to go through will apply to all versions of AGGrid, including React, Angular and Vue. We will start with the sample code here. I've got some column definitions, some grid options, I'm instantiating the grid here, and I'm fetching some data from the server here. And then on the right hand side we have the application here running. You will note we have an athlete column with people's names, and we have a country column with a list of countries. We'll start coding by setting row group equal to true on both the athlete and the country columns. We are now grouping first by athlete and then by country. It would be better to group by country first because each country will have multiple athletes. The columns are being grouped in the order that they appear in this column definition list here. So to change the order of the groups, we have two options. The first is to move country up to the top. Now if we look at our example, we can see it's doing country first and athlete second. There is a second option, and that is to use row group index instead of row group. So let's undo the code here and use row group index. Now the columns are back in the original order, and I'm using row group index instead of row group, and I'm providing 1 for athlete and 0 for country. The indexes are 0 based, and the grid will group by the lowest number first and then go up, which means it'll group by country first and then group by athlete. And that's what we can see here. We're grouping by country, and then underneath we can see it's grouping by athlete. So you can use row group or row group index to specify your grouping. The difference is that row group will group the columns in the order that they appear in the column definitions, whereas row group index allows you to specify explicitly what order you want the grouping done by. I'm just going to change my code back to using row group because it looks a small bit tidier. To help with the demo, I'm going to now make all columns resizable, and I'm going to allow rows to animate. Using the default call-def, I've set resizable to true, so that will set all columns to be resizable. And then I've specified animate rows to be true. That means that when I expand or collapse a group, the rows will animate into and out of place. You can also note that there's some duplication in the data here. I'm grouping by country and by athlete, but I'm still displaying the country and athlete columns. So here, United States is displayed even though it's displayed up here as well, and similarly for Michael Phelps. So it's good practice that if you're grouping by a column, that you also hide the column that you're grouping by to remove the duplication of data. Here I'm now hiding the country and the athlete columns, and if I expand, you can see that we're no longer showing country or athlete. You will note that when we group, the grid will by default provide us with an additional group column. That's this column up here. It's not one of the columns that we specified in our column defs. The grid created this column for us, and we call it the auto group column. Let's take a closer look by providing a button to print all of the grid's columns to the console. Here is my new function. I'm calling getAllGridColumns on the column API, and I'm printing the result to the console. If I then open up my console here and click on the button, I can see the results. The 10 columns here, 1 to 10, are the 10 columns we provided in the column def. And then the column at location 0, that's the auto group column. So if we look at column 1, we can see that that's the country column. The call def is the merge of this call def up here and the default call def here. So we've got hide, resizable, row group, etc. Then if I look at the first one, we can see that it's the auto group column, and the call def here is stuff that the grid configured. Looking inside this call def, so again that's the call def for the auto group column, we can see that the grid has provided a cell renderer of AG group cell renderer. That's the cell renderer that the grid will use in the cells here. So each cell has an instance of AG group cell renderer. And that cell renderer is what gives us the expand and collapse functionality, as well as putting the count after the name. The grid is providing a column ID here, AGGrid AutoColumn. That's useful if we want to look the column up in our API. The grid is also saying it doesn't want to filter in this column. It's given it a header name of group, so group will appear in the header here. Resizable true is actually coming from the default call def, so the autogroup column will pick up properties from the default call def just like other columns do. And show row group is how the grid tells this column it's showing group information, and we'll look at that a bit more closely later in this video. To recap, the grid created this column for us here. This column displays the group information. It did not come from the column definitions that we provided via the application. The grid created this column for us, and we saw the definition for this column by inspecting the columns and seeing the call def here on the auto group column. Now you can still provide a call def for the auto group column if you want to override some of the properties that the grid has set, and that's done by using the grid option auto group column def, and you provide a call def just like you would provide a call def normally. Here is the sample autogroup column def. I'm giving a header name of bananas, and on the demo you can see that bananas is now appearing as the column header. I've also set the cell renderer to null, which means the grid should not use a cell renderer. And then in the cells here, you can see that the expand and collapse functionality is gone because the grid is no longer using that cell renderer. Not very practical, but I wanted to put this in to show you what kind of control you have. I'll put the cell renderer back in, so I'll put in AG group cell renderer, hit save, hit refresh, and we can see now that the expand and collapse functionality is back. Now this line isn't needed because the AG group cell renderer is the default, so we can comment this out and again refresh and it's still working. But what I want to show you is this cell renderer params. Because everywhere that you specify cell renderer, you can also specify cell renderer params. So what params go in here? In here, you put the params for the cell renderer that you're using. Here we're using the AG group cell renderer, so here we'll put in params for the AG group cell renderer. And to see what they are, you can check the documentation. Inside the docs, you will see a rendering section, and that contains a page for the group cell renderer. If we scroll down here a bit, we'll see all of the properties listed for this cell renderer. Now I'll paste in some of these properties. I won't go through them all because they're a bit boring for this video, but these are some which people use very often. Okay, so suppress count, when that's set to true, you can see that the count of rows is no longer after each group name. Checkbox set to true puts a selection checkbox beside each group name. And then inner renderer is a way for us to specify a cell renderer that gets used for displaying the value in here. So the grid is still using the AG group cell renderer for displaying the entire cell, but when it comes to the value part, you have the possibility to insert a separate renderer in there. In our example, the cell renderer is putting the value into bold, and we can see that here in the cells. Now, if the inner renderer was not provided, what the grid will do is see if there is a cell renderer specified on the column we're grouping by. So here we're grouping by country. The grid will check the country column to see if there's a cell renderer. And if there is, it will use that as the inner renderer. Now note in our group column here, if we expand down to the levels which are not showing groups, i.e. the leaf levels, then the cells are blank. It would be better if we displayed something in these cells. And that's done by putting a field attribute inside the autogroup column def. So here with field attribute equal to sport, I'll now refresh my demo, expand United States and Michael Phelps, and here we can see that swimming is provided. Field isn't the only option you have for filling these cells in here. We can also show the opened group. For example, we could have Michael Phelps appear in these cells. To do that, we'll take away field and we'll set show opened group equal to true, which is a grid property. Down here we have show open group set to true. Then if we go back to Michael Phelps, we'll see that it is showing Michael Phelps in all of the leaf levels. Now you might wonder, why is this useful? It's useful when the number of children here is quite large. So let's set that up. Right now we are grouping by two columns, country and athlete. So let's stop grouping by athlete and only group by country. Now if we expand the group, we can see that the group row is up here and then we're still displaying the values underneath here. So if we scroll down, we can no longer see the group row, but the user still knows what group they're in because we're showing the open group here. So that's the grid property show opened group. I'm now going to undo some of my changes and talk to you about group display type. Here we have group display type. It can take four values: single column, multiple columns, group rows, or custom. The default is single column, and that's what we've been using up until now. When it's set to single column, it means the grid will create one column that we call the autogroup column for displaying all the group info. The next one we're going to look at is multiple columns. When set to multiple columns, the grid will create an autogroup column for each column we're grouping by. So here we have one column for showing the country group, and then we have another column for showing the athlete group. So we have two autogroup columns now, country and athlete. The grid creates these columns using the same mechanics as when we're doing single column. So that means we can use the autogroup column def to configure these columns. So let me uncomment these properties that we had in before, and then I'll refresh the grid. We can see that the grid is no longer showing the child count beside each group. Each group has a checkbox selection, and our inner renderer is rendering the group name in bold. We can also show that show opened group works on multiple columns. Let's comment this out and take these out. And now when we refresh, we can see that the columns are now showing the open group. Now there's a grid property that only makes sense when using multiple columns, and that is group hide open parents. So now show open group is off, hide open parents is on, and when we expand a group, you'll note that the children of the group don't appear underneath. So before, Michael Phelps would have appeared underneath United States. But now what the grid is doing is, as you expand a row, it's showing the children for that row starting at the same level. This can be useful if you want to have a more compact view of your data. Okay, let's take away hide open parents and move on to the next group display type, which is group rows. Now the group information is no longer displayed in a column. We can see here the age column is the first one, which isn't one of our group columns. If I make this age column more narrow, it's not truncating anything from the group names. That's because the group is using the entire row. And I can see here the blue border around the cell, which is spanning all columns. If I expand here, you'll see that the group levels are using the entire rows. And then when I get to the leaf levels, we're back to cells aligned with the columns. Group rows are useful if you want to show more content for each group inside the group row, and that's done using the group row renderer. When using the single or multiple column options, we had the ability to configure the column using the AutoGroup CallDef, and that had the ability to set the cell renderer and also the cell renderer params. When using group rows, the AutoGroup ColumnDef is not used. However, you can still configure the cell renderer, and that's done using these two properties here, the group row renderer and the group row renderer params. The group row renderer tells the grid what cell renderer to use for these rows. It defaults to the AG group cell renderer. That's the same as what happens with the AutoGroup column. It defaults to the AG group cell renderer as well, and this cell renderer is the one which gives us, for example, the expand and collapse functionality. But here we're going to use the default, so we can leave this out. And then, like all places where we specify components in the grid, the group row renderer has group row renderer params. This is a way that we can configure the group cell renderer, just like the cell renderer params inside the AutoGroup ColumnDef. So what we can do is take some of the properties here. Let's take suppress row count equal to true, put that up here, and we'll refresh, and we can see that the group rows no longer now have the row count. Let's also bring the inner renderer up. We bring that up to here, and then we refresh, and we'll see now that we're using bold. However, with this inner renderer, let's display something really long that takes up the entire width of the cell. Now the group rows are showing more information, making better use of the full width of the grid. Okay, let's take this all out and move on to the last group display type, which is custom. With group display type set to custom, our example is now showing blank cells. What the hell? Well, you see, with single columns and multiple columns, the grid created AutoGroup ColumnDefs for us to show the group information. That's not happening here. Also, when it's set to group rows, we would get rows showing the group information, which again isn't happening here. So the grid has done nothing to show the groups for us. It's allowing us to define this ourselves to give a custom configuration. I'm now creating a column definition for our custom group display. This is the column def we're going to use to show the group info. The important attribute here is show row group. When this is set to true, the grid will display the group values inside the cells. Our grid is now showing the group information inside the first column, but there's no expand and collapse functionality. To put that in, we're going to need to create a cell renderer, or we can use the grid provided group row cell renderer. With the group cell renderer configured, we now have the expand and collapse functionality back into our grid. Cool. And then as before, we can configure the group cell renderer using the cell renderer params. So let's put in the properties we used before. And here we can see we've got the checkbox selection, the cell renderer is now using bold, and it's no longer showing the row count after each group. So with show row group equal to true, we're able to give the same experience as if we were using the single column for group display type. That is, it looks like we're using the auto group column here, where all of the group information for all the columns is shown inside this first column. Now, it's also possible to give the experience of multiple columns, and that's done as follows. Let's take out these cell renderer params, let's duplicate this column definition here, and instead of saying show row group equals to true, which means show all the group information, we're going to get the first one to show country and the second one to show athlete. And we'll call the first column 111 and the second column 222. The header names don't make any difference here, it's just what you want to see on the screen. Now in our app we can see the 111 column is showing the group information for country and the 222 column is showing the group information for athlete. And that is the 4 group display types. We've seen single column and multiple columns that use the auto group column. We've seen group rows that's configured using the group row renderer, and we have seen custom where you define the columns yourself. Most of the time you'll use one of these two here, single column or multiple columns, if you want to show the groups in columns, or you'll use group rows if you want to use the entire row. You'll only need to use custom if you need to have more fine control over the group columns and you want to do something that you can't achieve using the auto group column. Also, the single and multiple columns will add and remove the auto group column as it's needed, and this is important when the user is dynamically grouping using the grid's UI, and that's done using the row group panel. The row group panel is enabled using the row group panel show grid property. There's 3 values it can have: always that it's set to now, always means it'll always be displayed, never is the default, that is don't display it, and then only when grouping means show it when there's a grouping active. Then in our demo we can see at the top here, this panel drag here to set row groups is where we will drag columns in order to group by that column. Note that in our column definitions we're not grouping by any column, so the data is presented without any row grouping. So what I'd like to do is group by a column. So let me drag country and we'll drop it into the drop zone here and drop, and no grouping happens. Well, in order for a column to be groupable we need to enable row group. So let's put in here enable row group to true for country. With that set to true, country is now groupable, so we can drag country and put it into the drop zone and let go, and now we have dynamically grouped by country. I can then click on the X up here to ungroup, and country becomes a normal column again. Now I want to group by more than one column, so let me cheat a little bit and take enable row group and put that onto the default column def. Now I can group by multiple columns, so I'll bring country up and then I'll bring athlete up, and here now we're grouping by country and then by athlete. Now I said cheat a little bit by using the default col def. You might wonder, why did I say cheat? Well, it's now allowing me to group by all columns, even these columns over here, gold, silver, bronze and total, which are measure columns, are showing values. It normally doesn't make sense to allow your user to group by all columns, especially if they're just showing number values like this here. So in your application, you will probably configure it so the user can only group by columns where it makes sense in your application for the user to group by that column. Wow, this is a lot of information. Let's just take a little bit of a break. So pause me, go out and have a cigarette. If you don't smoke, now would be a good time to start. Okay, you back? Right. Let's show the sidebar by setting the grid property sidebar equal to true. We can then see here on the right hand side there's a sidebar. Now the sidebar is a whole big different topic that I'm not going to go into. All I wanted to do is show you that you can group using the sidebar as well by dragging the column from here down to the group rows. And there we've now grouped by country. And we can see the country appears grouped both in the drop zone at the top here and also the drop zone in the side panel. And I can remove the grouping by clicking on the X here or by clicking on the X up here. So let's do it on the sidebar this time. Good. The sidebar also shows the visibility of each column. These checkboxes here, if the column is unchecked, it means the column is not visible. You will note that when I drag a column from the grid and bring it into the drop zone, it will become not visible. So we'll drag country in, let go, and now you can see the checkbox is not checked and country is gone. The grid assumed because we dragged the column out of the grid that we don't want the column in the grid anymore. And then the inverse happens when we ungroup. You will note that when I stop grouping by country, the country column appears again and the checkbox appears back in the sidebar. If you want to turn these two features off so the columns just stay in the grid all the time, then you do that with these two big named properties here. So the first one, suppress drag leaves hides columns. That means when you drag a column out of the grid like here, the column still remains visible. So let's group by country and we can see that it remains visible. The second property, suppress make column visible after ungroup. This means when we ungroup, the column will not be made visible. So to demonstrate this, I'll hide country and then I'll ungroup by country and we will see that it remains hidden. Righty, this video is about 20 minutes and I think that's enough for today. So I'm going to have to do another video, a part 2 of row grouping. There's still a lot more I want to get through. If you did have a cigarette for the first time earlier, it was good. wasn't it? You might feel a bit of a headache. Be persistent, keep at it, try it again, and you'll get there. You'll become a good smoker. Okay, peace out. Till next time.